In London, the hour before the sun comes up is quiet in a way no other city is. The gas lamps flicker weakly in the fog. Horse-drawn taxis disappear into the mist like they've been eaten, and the soft ringing of a faraway bell sounds very sad. I remember that night very clearly. Because it was the night, a swan's cry was heard over the Thames River at midnight, and after that, Sherlock Holmes and I were caught in a sad story that would affect more than just our street. It started with a messenger who was all wet from the river fog, holding a telegram that sounded scary and important. Inside that folded paper was a call to a case that was different from any we had ever seen. It was a story where music, craziness, and death were all mixed up, and where even Holmes, who was great at thinking, had to face strange things that thinking alone couldn't explain. If these memories pull you into the foggy streets of Holmes's London, where danger hides in every dark doorway, then I ask you to stay with us. Subscribe, share, and be here with us so you can follow along with every turn in the case. Because only by staying close can you understand the whole mystery. The fog that night was very thick, making even the sound of carriage wheels on the stones of Baker Street quiet, and giving the lamps a ghostly glow that moved with the air. I was sitting near the fireplace, with my journal open in front of me, but my thoughts had moved from the page to the slow, antsy man who walked back and forth in front of the fire. Holmes, with his robe on loosely, held his violin under his chin and played a very quiet, soft tune. It was not a song I knew, but a piece of some sad music he made up himself. The sound was soft and wanting, but it also had a worry that seemed to shake in the air. He played not for fun, but to help him think. Each note was a question, each pause a doubt. Outside, the wind blew down the street, and from far away came the long-way sound of a river steamboat on the Thames. "Listen, Watson," he said all of a sudden, putting down his bow. "Do you hear it?" "I hear nothing but the wind." "Exactly," said Holmes, putting the violin on the fireplace mantel. "It is in quiet times like this that London shows its secrets. The city is asleep, but its dreams give it away." He turned to the window, and the lamplight made sharp lines on his cheeks. "There, look at the way the fog is moving. Something is moving inside it." I went to the window with him, but I could only see the dim light of the nearest gas lamp. Everything else was a rolling cloud of fog, where shapes moved like a bad dream. "It is almost midnight," I said, "and the city, even with its badness, must get tired." Holmes gave a small smile. "Oh, my dear friend, badness does not watch the clock." He was about to start walking again when we heard a sound. It was so quiet and strange that for a second I thought it was the echo of his violin. It came from across the river, far away but clear, a single cry that was not human or like any animal, long, shaky, and sad. It was the cry of a swan. Holmes became very still. "Strange," he mumbled. "They do not call at night." Before either of us could say more, there was a quick knock on the door, sharp and uneven, like it was made by a shaky hand. Mrs. Hudson, who was surprised, showed up for a moment on the stairs, and after Holmes gave her a signal, she let the visitor come in. The man who stumbled in was wet from head to toe, his hat was dripping, and his coat stuck to him as if he had just come out of the river. He was breathing in short gasps, and in his hand he held a crumpled telegram. "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, before falling into the chair by the fireplace. Holmes took the paper quickly, and you couldn't tell what he was thinking as his eyes read the words. He passed it to me without saying anything. "Come at once to Grosvenor Place. A death, maybe murder. Strange things happening. The river. Midnight." It was not signed. Holmes's eyes looked up at the man. "Who sent this?" The man swallowed hard. "I was told by a lady, sir, a lady by the river. She gave me a coin to deliver it, and then disappeared into the fog. I promise I never saw her face." Holmes looked at him a moment longer, then turned to his desk, where he had already put his hat and walking stick, as if he was expecting the call. "Watson, your gun, please. It seems the night does not want to let us rest." In a few minutes, we were going down the steps of 221B, and the fog wrapped around us like wet wool. The street seemed empty, except for the far-off flame of the lamplighter. But the city was alive under its cover, with the drip of water from roofs, the creak of faraway wood, and the quiet hum of life that never fully stops. We got a horse-drawn taxi, and as it rattled toward the riverbank, I saw Holmes's face against the blurry gaslight. His eyes, sharp and looking far away, had that special focused look that he only got when he smelled a new case. "You noticed the words of the telegram," he said suddenly. "No name, no greeting, just the river and the time. But we have no client, Holmes. Only a message and a scared messenger." He smiled a little. "My dear Watson, a mystery that comes without an owner is often the one that tells the most. The sender trusts in need, not a name. That is a puzzle in its purest form." The taxi turned sharply toward the Thames. The fog got thicker until the lamps were blurry moons floating in the dark. The river was ahead. We couldn't see it, but we could hear it. The slow splash of water against stone, the clank of a chain, the faraway groan of wood. Somewhere quiet and strange, that Swan's cry sounded again, softer now, as if the night itself was echoing its sadness. At Grosvenor Place, we were met by a police officer, whose oil lamp made a pale circle in the darkness. "Mr. Holmes, sir?" he asked, not sure. "Inspector Lestrade said you might be coming." "Then we are not the only ones who are curious," Holmes answered. "Lead the way." We went into a townhouse whose door was partly open, with a trail of wet footprints leading inside. The hall was dim and smelled a little like river plants and something sharper, maybe iodine or alcohol. A maid was waiting near the staircase, and her eyes were red from crying. "In the music room, sir," the officer whispered. The room was big and fancy, but it was messy everywhere. A candlestick lay knocked over on the carpet, its wax pooled like pale blood. Near the fireplace, where a grand piano stood half open, lay a woman in white. Her dress, which was once beautiful, was now damp and torn, and her pale hand rested on the keys as if she had fallen while playing. Holmes kneeled next to her, moving very carefully. "No water in the lungs," he said softly. "She did not drown." Lestrade appeared from the doorway, his sharp face looking tired. "Evening, Mr. Holmes. Or should I say morning? This one is a real mess. No sign that anyone broke in, and yet she's as dead as can be. Her husband is away on business. A message was received only an hour ago. None of the servants heard a thing." Holmes's eyes moved to the piano. One key, a high E, was pressed down, and its string was still shaking a little. "The sound, Watson. Do you hear it?" I leaned closer. "It's still vibrating, but she must have hit it when she fell. Or someone wanted it to look that way," said Holmes. "Look here. A single feather is caught under the lid." He lifted it carefully with his tweezers. A white swan's feather, with a little stain on its tip. Lestrade frowned. "You think the bird was in the house?" Holmes said nothing. His eyes moved instead to the open window, where the fog floated in like slow smoke. Beyond was the dark shine of the Thames. "The river has not let her go completely," he mumbled. "Watson, notice the wetness on the bottom of her dress. River water, but no mud. She was placed here after she died, not pulled from the bank. Someone wanted to make a trick out of the facts." I shivered, because the quiet that followed seemed to be alive. The only sound was the soft ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the house. Holmes stood up suddenly. "We must know who she was before we can know why. Lestrade, the people in the house?" "3 servants, all here." The husband is expected tomorrow from Paris. Her name is Mrs. Eleanor Swan." "Indeed," said Holmes softly. "A good name for such a sad picture." He moved toward the mantel where a photograph stood. A young woman sitting by the river, with a violin on her lap, the same face that was now pale and still in front of us. Holmes studied it for a long moment, then turned away. "Watson, remember the cry we heard on the river not half an hour ago?" I could not forget it. "Then I think, my dear friend, that it was not an animal's cry at all, but a man's trick, a signal, maybe even a confession. We are at the start of a very tricky mystery, one where sound itself might be both the message and the disguise." He pulled his coat closer and looked at the fog outside the window, as if he was reading a message in it. "There is a person at work here," he said quietly, "who plays with death like it's the strings of a violin." And as the first gray hint of morning came through the mist, the house seemed to hold its breath. Holmes turned to me, his eyes shining with that excited joy that only the hunt for something unexplainable could bring out. "Come, Watson," he said. The cry across the Thames was just the beginning. The real music of this sad story has not yet started. The house had that special stillness that comes after a disaster, a quiet so total that the smallest sound becomes strangely important. A stair creaked far upstairs. A drop fell from a forgotten pitcher into a bowl in a distant kitchen. The flame of a candle moved as if it too was afraid of being noticed. Lestrade, with his usual quick way of doing things, had gone to question the officer in the hall, leaving Holmes and me alone with the dead woman and the fog that pressed its gray face against the window. The keys of the piano, half hidden under the cover, looked like a row of teeth in a closed mouth. That one high E still seemed to have a ghost of a vibration, but I thought it was just my imagination in such a haunted room. Holmes kneeled again, not by the body, but by the fireplace rug, his long finger tracing over it like a reader touches Braille. He spoke in that flat voice that someone who didn't know him would think was uncaring, but which I knew was focus put to work. "Look at the drag mark, Watson. Not heavy enough for a big man, not light enough for a child. It is the sign of a woman who has been carried carefully by someone who knows the house well enough to not bump into the furniture. There is no clumsy person here." I looked at the line he was pointing to. To me, it was just a faint mark on the carpet fibers running from the window to where poor Mrs. Swan lay. "And yet," I said, "there is no smear on the windowsill, no stain on the floorboards." "Exactly. Whoever used that window did it from inside. The open window is for show, not the way out." He stood up, and his eyes went back to the piano. With a careful move, he lifted the cover and laid his hand lightly on the keys. Dust on the low notes, none on the high ones. Someone has practiced here recently, and not with gentle hands. He opened the piano stool. Inside was a folder of music, neatly kept. On the first page was a sad night song, with the title written in a handwriting that was both fancy and nervous, "A Midnight Swan." Underneath, a smaller line of letters said, "Based on a Riverside song." There was a stamp from a publisher in a street called the Strand, and in the corner a faint watermark that might have been a swan if the light had been better. Holmes's eyes lit up. There are tunes that are just little songs, and there are tunes that are signals. Do you remember the cry on the water? I do, and it makes me uncomfortable. He put the music back and shut the stool softly, as if he didn't want to wake a sleeping thing. Let us meet the living before we talk too much about the dead. At the doorway, we found the maid who had been waiting by the stairs, a small girl with a stiff apron that shook a little with her trembling hands. Holmes had a direct way with servants that usually worked. "Your name, child?" "Rose, sir." "Rose Hales. How long have you worked in this house?" 8 months, sir." "And Mrs. Swan, what did she usually do in the evening?" "Music, sir." Most nights she would play for hours if the river was quiet. She used to say the sound was sweeter when the fog was thick. Was she alone when she played? The girl's eyes, red from crying, looked down at the floor. Not always, sir. Holmes waited. His silence is a question. The girl swallowed. Sometimes Miss Eliza would come down. Mr. Swan didn't like the late hours. But he's in Paris, sir, and Miss Eliza is... We haven't seen her since yesterday afternoon. Her voice broke on that last word. Holmes's eyes flickered to Lestrade, who had come back when he heard voices. You forgot to mention a missing daughter, Inspector. Lestrade's jaw got tight. Because she's not missing in the way the police mean. Mr. Holmes, she's a spirited young lady with a mind of her own, and yesterday she went to the hat-makers on Sloane Street. She often visits a friend in Pimlico without telling anyone. That's how young people are these days. The young will always be blamed for how they are now, Holmes answered. But a house with a dead mother and a missing daughter might need stronger words than custom. Where is the governess? A new person appeared on the landing above, calm where the maid was shaky, her dark dress plain, her collar perfectly white. She came down the stairs like someone who had already prepared herself for strangers and sadness. I am Margaret Vale, she said, and her voice had a musical sound even in that quiet place. Mr. Swan hired me when Miss Eliza started her German and violin lessons. If you must ask questions, sir, do it quickly and with respect. There has been enough violence here. Holmes bowed, and in that simple move I saw that he understood her type and would not waste words trying to win her over. Miss Vale, we will be as quick as we can. When did you last see Mrs. Swan alive? Before dinner, she answered. She said she had a headache and asked me to help Eliza with her scales. At 9, Eliza left the room. She gets excited when the river fog comes in. At 10, I checked the music room. The door was closed. Mrs. Swan wanted to be alone when she practiced. I did not bother her. And Eliza's room was empty? Yes. Did she have permission to be out so late? The governess met Holmes's eyes without looking away. Eliza's permission is decided by her mood, not by a schedule. She is 17. The world calls loudly to a young person's imagination at that age. Holmes's eyes moved to the stairs and the dark shadows above. Her room, if you please. The room had the neat mess of a young person. A shawl thrown over the back of a chair. A glove dropped halfway in a drawer, as if it was stopped in the middle of being put away. A narrow bed with the covers turned down. The window looked out over the river. The fog pressed against the glass like wool. On the writing table was a small case, used often, and inside was a violin that was not fancy, but was well taken care of. On the table itself there was a smear of river dampness and a faint half-circle of dirt on the sill, like a shoe had rested there for a moment. Holmes picked up the bow and looked at the horsehair. Well used, he mumbled. Cared for with saving, not spending. She cares for her instrument like a partner, not a toy. He put it back and lifted a page that had slid halfway under the case. A line of music was scribbled there in a hurry. A simple, sad tune, only 5 notes repeating in a way that stuck in your head. Underneath it, a note in pencil sent a tingling feeling up my back. Midnight. Listen for the river's voice. Do you recognize the handwriting? He asked Miss Vale. She studied it. The color left her face and then came back as if she had controlled her shock. It is Eliza's. She is always writing down bits of tunes she hears on the water. There are boatmen who whistle, street musicians who wander, a blind man with a trumpet at the bridge. She believes there is a language in it all. Eleanor, Mrs. Swan, let her do it too much, I think. Let her do it, Holmes said dryly, is a word only the living use for the dead. He put the page down and went to the closet. On the inside of the door, a hat was pinned. The kind of knitted cap a girl uses to hide her bright hair when she wants to be less noticed on the streets. Below it hung a cloak the color of the river. Both were damp. "Do you see, Watson? We have a daughter who listened at midnight, a mother who played with the door shut, and a house that looks out onto the Thames." He turned back to Miss Vale. "What is between this music room and the river?" "A private stair," she admitted after a moment of not wanting to say. Mr. Swan had it built to avoid waking the servants when he came back from his club. "It leads to a small gate on the riverbank. Only the family has the key." "Only the family," Holmes repeated, and the way he said it sounded like a final decision. "Rose, bring me whatever keys are kept here." The maid's footsteps ran and returned, and she pressed into Holmes's hand a ring with 3 keys. A thin brass one that was new, a thicker old iron one for some inside lock, and a little silver one that was as delicate as jewelry. Holmes balanced them on his hand like a jeweler would. "The brass for the private stair, I think, the silver for some box or desk." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, have you checked Mr. Swan's study?" "I have. It's locked, and I don't have a key." Holmes held up the silver key. "Shall we?" The study smelled of tobacco and ink. That manly smell that says business even before you read a single paper. On the desk was a blotter, a notebook half filled, a telegram from Paris confirming he was leaving and suggesting a return delayed by a meeting. Holmes did not stand on ceremony. His eye ran along the shelves, not for books, but for empty spaces, and from a lower drawer he took out a flat mahogany case, which opened right away with the silver key. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, and on the first envelope was a handwriting I now recognized as the late Mrs. Swan's. Holmes did not open it. He has, despite what people say, a certain respect for private sadness. He just weighed it for a moment on his hand and put it back exactly as he had found it. "What does a man lock and a woman play?" he said, thinking out loud. Opposite actions on the surface of the same deep thing. Lestrade, who had less patience for fancy words, cleared his throat. "Mr. Swan will answer for his keys when he arrives. For now, I would like to find out how a dead body travels dry from the river to a music room without anyone seeing." Holmes's eyes went to the carpet again. "By hands that have carried such things before. There are ways to move unseen along the riverbank when the fog makes it hard to see. And there are those who know the river's moods like a teacher knows a child's. The feather, Inspector, that strange little thing. What does it tell you?" "That a bird got in or a fool left clues," Lestrade snapped. "I prefer fools to ghosts." Holmes's smile was quick and not warm. "So do I, but we must be careful which fools we choose. Miss Vale, does Eliza have friends who are musicians, teachers other than you, places where she listens without being seen?" The governess paused, and I could see her struggling between being loyal to the living and telling the truth. "There is a small group," she said at last, "that meets from time to time when fog covers the river. They see themselves as savers of old tunes, street songs, boatmen's songs, pieces the city has forgotten. I have warned Eliza. I do not go. They save a corner near the steps by Hungerford Bridge, and sometimes in a warehouse loft near the fish market when the police are friendly." "And they call themselves?" "The Swan Benefit," she said, not wanting to. "A foolish name. Charity concerts for river widows and such. But music attracts all sorts. There are men who hide their bad intentions in kindness." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Names, Miss Vale, quickly." She gave him 3. A violinist from another country named Victor Grossman, a printer in the Strand named Terence Pike, and a singer who used the name Mrs. Adela Shaw, though no one believed it was her real name. Holmes listened without taking notes. His memory for names is as exact as a record book. "We shall bother them soon enough," he said. For now, Inspector, I suggest putting a man at the private stair gate and another at the river steps. Whoever set up this scene may have left by water, but actors often return to admire their work." Lestrade grunted yes, and a moment later his orders were given, and the whispered sounds in the house rose and fell again to quiet. The maid had gone back to her kitchen. Miss Vale stood near the door, as if guarding the dead person's privacy. Holmes returned to the music room and stood for a long time in front of the piano without touching it. The candle made a tiny pool on the polished lid, where a thread of fog seemed to swim. "Watson," he said at last, very softly, "do you smell the faintest odor of oil? Something between a musical instrument maker's shop and a barge?" I sniffed, and there it was, just a hint that might have been nothing at another time. A clean metal smell under the beeswax and the dampness. "I do. It is not from the fireplace." He crossed to the window and looked down where the riverbank would be if the fog cleared. "Pulleys," he mumbled. "Lines and wheels well oiled. There is more of a show in this than we guessed." He straightened up, and the light caught his eye like a spark. "Come, my dear friend, we will not wake the dead with our steps, but the river will not wait for daylight. Music travels differently at night, and I would like to hear what London says to those who are willing to listen." Miss Vale's hands tightened. "You will find her?" she asked, and for the first time her calm slipped, showing the person underneath the governess's armor. "Eliza is wild, but not bad. She believes beauty is a kind of truth, that is all." Eleanor, Mrs. Swan, encouraged her imagination. Holmes's voice, when it came, had a gentleness that surprised those who only knew him from the stories in the newspapers. "I shall find what there is to be found," he said. "Whether it brings comfort, I cannot promise, but truth is the only medicine that does not turn to poison." We went down that private stair, our lamps throwing small circles of light on the narrow walls. At the door, Holmes tried the brass key, and the lock turned so smoothly it showed it had been used recently. The gate opened onto a world of gray on gray. The Thames, which we could not see but could hear, moved with a patient sound between its banks. There were people in the mist, 2 police officers now at their posts, a boatman huddled under a big coat, a stray cat that saw us and slipped away like a piece of cloth cut by a knife. And there, as we stood with the dampness seeping through our coats, a bit of a song rose from somewhere downriver. It was not an accident, not a random drunk's tune. It came with a purpose, repeating those 5 simple notes I had seen on Eliza's paper, a call as clear as a knock on a door. The fog caught it and did not quiet it, but instead spread it all around us, so that it seemed the river was singing from inside our own chests. Holmes raised his head, and in that moment he was a hunting dog on a real trail. "Hungerford," he said, "or close to it. Do you hear the echo against the iron of the bridge? They are calling to someone who knows how to listen." He shut the gate softly behind us, and for a moment we stood with the city's old breath on our faces, feeling the difference between the life in houses and the life on the water. Somewhere a bell rang the quarter hour, muffled and insistent. Holmes touched my sleeve, and we moved along the riverbank, our footsteps matching the beat of the tune that pulled us on, while behind us in the music room of Grosvenor Place, the single high E, whether in memory or in reality, seemed to still be ringing. The fog had thinned by morning, but it left behind a coldness that stuck to the cobblestones and to one's thoughts. Holmes and I had hardly slept, because the night's strange song still echoed quietly in our ears, those 5 notes that floated from the river, as if the city itself were whispering its secrets. By the time the first pale light came through the fog-stained windows of Baker Street, Holmes had already sent a messenger to the Strand, asking for information on 3 names, Victor Grossman, Terence Pike, and Mrs. Adela Shaw. He had written the note with that quick, spidery handwriting of his that seemed to write in thought instead of ink. He now stood by the fireplace, a half-burnt cigarette hanging from his fingers, his eyes half closed, as if his mind was floating somewhere between a dream and a plan. "It is not the song alone, Watson," he mumbled. "It is how it keeps going. A tune so simple that a normal ear forgets it, yet made in a way that it gets stuck in your memory. Such tunes are not written by accident. They are built piece by piece by those who want to be remembered." I was still shaking the sleep from my body when Mrs. Hudson came in with the morning mail. Among the usual envelopes, a small folded note had no address, only a pale mark on the seal, the shape of a swan. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside, written in a fancy but uneven handwriting, were 3 lines. "The river remembers all who sing to it. Midnight returns tonight. Follow the music, and you will find the truth." Holmes let out a quiet breath that was not a laugh or a surprise. "Our writer prefers poetry to practical things," he said. "But the handwriting, do you see, Watson? The upward curve of the F in follow is the same as the notes we saw in Miss Eliza Swan's line of music. She has written this herself. Then she is alive." I said, "Possibly, or she wants us to think she is." He turned the paper toward the light, showing faint smudges where river dampness had touched it. "Delivered by hand, probably in the early hours. Our visitor was expected." He stepped to the window. Outside, the city woke up slowly. Fruit and vegetable sellers called through the mist. The milk carts rattled past, and London went back to its endless quiet noise. But Holmes was already separate from it, his eyes fixed not on the street, but on something unseen. "We must visit the Strand," he said at last. "There is a printer who deals in more than paper. Mr. Pike, if I am not mistaken, will not be happy he was born today." The fog thickened again by the time we reached the Strand. The air was heavy with the smell of ink and hot metal, and every alley seemed alive with the sound of printing presses. Pike's shop, Pike & Sons, Fine Stationery and Notices, was squeezed between a tobacco shop and a closed theater. Its window showed invitations, booklets, and posters of all kinds, weddings, talks, and music shows among them. A small sign read, "Printer to the Swan Benefit Society." Holmes walked in as if he owned the place, brushing a bit of soot from his sleeve. A bell tinkled above, and from behind the counter came a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and a droopy mustache. "Morning, gentlemen," he said, looking at us tiredly. "What can I print for you?" "A truth," said Holmes, "though I am afraid your machines may not be able to do it." The man's smile faded. "If you've come about a bill—" "We have come about a death," Holmes cut in. "Mrs. Eleanor Swan of Grosvenor Place." The printer turned pale, and I saw his fingers move toward the drawer under the counter. Holmes's hand moved faster, pulling out his card with a flick and putting it down in front of him like a challenge. "Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. You can either speak to us freely now or to Inspector Lestrade in 15 minutes." Pike's jaw tightened. Then he gave up. "I've printed nothing illegal," he mumbled. "On the contrary," Holmes said softly, "you have printed beauty, and beauty, when used badly, can become the most dangerous illegal thing of all. Tell me of The Midnight Swan." The man paused, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "It's a song," he whispered. "A hymn, some call it. Grossman wrote it or found it, depending on who you believe. The Swan Benefit performed it for the first time a month ago, down by the river steps. Only special people were invited. They said the music could make the water answer back." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And Miss Eliza Swan was one of these special people?" "She was the voice," Pike said sadly. "The purest I'd ever heard. But the music changed her, sir. It changes all of them. They say the river listens, that each note wakes something that sleeps below. I thought it was all nonsense until last week, when Adela Shaw disappeared. Then the girl's mother died, and now the tune is back again. Holmes tapped the counter with a knuckle. You have a copy of the music? Pike paused. Only the first few lines. The rest Grossman kept locked up. Then the first few will be enough. The printer got a sheet of heavy paper, its edges slightly bent from dampness. Across the lines was a melody as strange as any I'd seen. Simple, yes, but marked with odd slides and strangely spaced rests. Asterisk. As if it were made for a language not quite human. Holmes studied it for a long moment, then folded it carefully into his pocketbook. You will say nothing of our visit, he said. But if Grossman, or anyone from your group, comes to see you, send a message to Baker Street at once. Outside, the wind had started to blow, pulling at the fog as if to show the bones of the city underneath. Holmes walked quickly, his eyes looking down, talking more to himself than to me. Grossman writes the music. Pike prints the invitations. Shaw sings the words, and Miss Swan becomes the echo. A neat little group of 4, and now it's down to 2. We stopped for lunch at a small cafe off Charing Cross. Holmes ate little, his fingers tapping on the table without thinking. There is a plan to these performances, he said finally. Each one near the river, each at midnight, and each followed by a disappearance or death. I would bet that the song is not just played, but sent, maybe by an instrument, maybe by a machine. The cry we heard across the Thames may have been made by such a device. You believe the sound itself is the weapon, or the trap. His eyes were far away. We are dealing with minds that understand music not as art, but as a building, a structure built to hold something older than a song. He stood up suddenly, tossing a few coins on the table. Come, Watson, we must meet the builder. The address Pike had given was near the river, behind a row of warehouses, where the air smelled of tar and salt. A sign, cracked and faded, had the name V. Grossman, Instrument Maker. Inside, the darkness was thick and full of dust. Violins hung from the ceiling like sleeping bats. Cellos rested in their stands like guards. At a bench under a single lamp sat a man with a lot of white hair and the big, careful hands of a craftsman. He did not look up as we came in. I know why you have come, he said in a voice that was low and deep with a slight accent. You have heard the song. Holmes bowed his head. And others have died for it. Grossman's fingers stopped moving. They died of not knowing, not of art. The river wants harmony. Those who break it are punished. The river, Holmes repeated softly, is water and mud, not a judge. The man laughed once, a dry, bitter sound. You English think the Thames is tame, but it is old, older than your empire, older than your saints. I just gave it back its voice. Holmes moved closer, his voice still polite, but with a sharp edge. And Miss Eliza Swan, has the river taken her too? Grossman looked up then, and the lamplight caught his eyes. They were strange, pale, almost without color. She is chosen, he said. Her voice completes the circle. When she sings tonight, you will understand. Where? Holmes demanded. But Grossman only smiled. At midnight, by the water. Listen for the Swan. Holmes's hand moved like a striking snake, and before the man could react, he had grabbed a scrap of paper from under the bench. On it was drawn a rough map, the curve of the Thames, a mark near Hungerford Bridge, and underneath it a single word, Requiem. Holmes let him go and turned to leave. We will be at your concert, he said coldly. I hope your audience is as forgiving as your river. Outside, the air had grown darker, the clouds thick with the promise of rain. Holmes walked quickly, the map clutched in his hand. Midnight by Hungerford, he mumbled. The second part of the sad story begins tonight. I looked back once through the dusty window of the workshop. I thought I saw Grossman lift a violin to his chin and pull the bow across its strings. The sound that reached us was quiet and sad, but behind it was something deeper, a vibration that seemed to stir the very stones under our feet. Holmes paused, listening. Then, almost to himself, he said, "So the river sings after all. But the question is, Watson, who writes the final part?" The feather lay on Holmes's table, as if it had floated there on its own, a delicate white curve whose quill had a troubling spot of color near the tip. It looked so harmless against the wood that a man who didn't know about crime might have smiled at our worry. But I had learned long ago that evil often uses the gentlest things to show itself. Holmes had put it under the window to catch the pale morning light. And there he stood with his magnifying glass, turning it slowly like a jeweler might look at a stone with a flaw that makes it priceless. "Cygnus allure," he said as if thinking out loud. "Mute swan. See the curve of the vein, the width and softness of the smaller feathers. Our visitor has a taste for fancy things." "The stain," I mumbled. "Blood?" He brought the quill closer to the flame without letting it burn. "Not blood, not rust. Look at the shine. When the light hits it, it shines like something made, not spilled. There is resin here, and a dye." He lowered the glass, and the usual dry sound of his thinking came into his voice. "Cochineal, most likely, mixed with shellac, a violin-maker's varnish. Watson, it's a mix of a hat-maker's plume and a craftsman's tool. We have Grossman's shop on one side and Sloane Street on the other, and a line between them drawn across a dead woman's piano. Then the feather was not a token, but a tool or a signature." "Both," he answered. "Come, we must ask two different trades the same question, and see who blushes first." Within the hour, we had crossed to Houndsditch through the city's growing noise, and the air there was raw with the practical smells of business. Damp rope, oiled leather, animal skins that had traveled far to meet sharp knives, and the strange, powdery smell of feathers. The shop we were looking for had no name on the glass, as if it sold secrets its customers valued. But the window showed white sprays and curled quills, and inside the owner was pale like someone who lives among constant snow. He greeted Holmes like a man greets a buyer of fine things, with that quietness that is a sign of respect in the business. Holmes laid the feather down on the felt cloth. "A mute swan, killed in London or brought from somewhere else?" The man's eyelids narrowed, happy to be asked the right question first. "Local river," he said. "You can tell from the dirt stuck near the bottom of the quill. Foreign birds don't carry the Thames in their bones. But you won't find many swans killed without permission. The crown protects them." "Just so," Holmes replied. "And this color?" The dealer bent, sniffed, and with his thumbnail scraped a tiny bit onto a slip of white paper. "Not makeup, not paint," he thought out loud. "It's a varnish, thin as a whisper. Whoever put it on knew to keep the feather parts free, or the feather would clump. Someone who works with things as thin as hair. Men who make stringed instruments have that touch." He straightened up. "A fancy conversation, sir. Not my area. If you want color, you go to the ladies' side of the business." "The ladies' side?" Holmes repeated, a hint of amusement in his eye. "Sloane Street, perhaps?" The man's expression quietly confessed. "There's a house there that does a lot of business in white. Brides and charity balls love to look like angels. They buy river feathers when they can get them. They wear differently than goose. Name it. Miss Partridge. You won't find better." Sloane Street had the shine of fashion, even with the fog smudging its bright windows. In Miss Partridge's shop, the floor was quieted by carpets, and the air smelled faintly of starch and gardenia. A display of hats and veils made a show of modesty on the heads of painted forms, and at the far counter, a woman whose posture was as stiff as a corset bowed her head with the controlled warmth of one who sells to the rich. Holmes did not waste her time. He set the feather on black velvet, and at once the red stain stood out with a wicked little glow. "Ah," she said, a little too quickly, "a river swan. I have sold those to Mrs. Swan of Grosvenor Place." Holmes bowed his head as if he expected that line in a play. White for a lady named Swan is clever. But what about red on white? The hat maker's mouth tightened. "I do not deal in ugly things." Holmes's silence asked again. She took a breath, giving in. 2 weeks ago, a gentleman ordered a spray of swan feathers, with a faint blush at the tip, to be worn on his chest for a private concert. He was very specific that the color be permanent and would not smear a dress. I told him I would not stain a river bird with makeup. He came back the next day with a bottle of his own lacquer and dye, and applied it himself with a brush as thin as a hair. I provided the feather. He provided the sin. The gentleman's name? I never ask. My record book knows what I should not, but I can tell you that he paid in cash. And his hands smelled of turpentine and oil. She glanced at the feather again, and the faintest shiver crossed the stiff line of her shoulders. "He whistled when he worked, sir, a thin little tune that got under my skin like a splinter." Holmes's brow lifted just a tiny bit. 5 notes? She stared. 5, yes. How did you? "Because London hums, Miss Partridge," he said very quietly. "And some of us have ears." He closed the velvet over the feather and slid it away. "If the gentleman returns, you will send a message to Baker Street. You will also put aside any future order in white that asks to be touched with red. Charge for your morals." Few do. Her politeness turned into something like thankfulness, and we left her in her temple of art, with her reputation restored and a fear made profitable by a warning. On the sidewalk, the air had sharpened. The fog broke into torn pieces that let through a gray light, and a thin drizzle began to spot the street. "Grossman," I said. "Grossman," Holmes agreed. "But not alone. Our feather moves between the river and the strand, between the ladies' business and the men's craft. We have a group where we thought we had one person, and there is still the instrument on which the house itself may have been played. We returned by way of Victoria, avoiding the crowd around Charing Cross and at Grosvenor Place. We found Lestrade talking quietly with 2 officers. The inspector's lean face had that special look of a hard-working man who doesn't have enough facts. "Mr. Swan is on the noon train from Dover," he said as a greeting. "He sent a message that he lands at Folkestone. Then his man sent me a message about the change at Ashford. And here I am, the chief messenger for an English gentleman's troubles." Holmes brushed past the talk of travel with a nod. "I will not keep you from your train schedules. I need 10 minutes with the music room and the private stair. If in that time I cry out, do not send a hero. Send a man with a knife and a steady hand." Lestrade stared. "A knife?" "I believe the house has been wired," Holmes replied, and in his voice was the stern pleasure of a problem about to be solved. We entered the music room and went at once to the window where the fog licked at the sill. Holmes kneeled not to the carpet this time, but to the space between the baseboard and the floor. He took from his pocket a sliver of steel and ran it carefully along the crack. It met something that hummed under the touch. "Wire," he said, "as thin as a spider's web, coated to keep it from making a sound unless called upon." He pressed the window pane. The faintest vibration stirred the air. A whisper your nerves heard before your ear noticed it. "Good heavens," I breathed. He stood up and traced the line along the wall with his fingertips, like a blind man reads a face, behind the curtain, under the top part of the window frame, along the inner side of the window frame, so cleverly placed that daylight, if there was any, would not have shown it. He found it again at the leg of the grand piano, where the mahogany wood showed a tiny bruise. Then he crouched beside the instrument and lifted the keyboard cover as he had done the night before. "The high E," he said, "not struck, but held. See here, Watson, under the key is a little cap of leather, and from the cap a loop as fine as a hair. Our murderer had fingers like a stringed instrument maker, and patience like a saint. He set up the instrument to hold a single note when the window was touched, and he led his line through the room and out to the river, where a tug on some hidden pulley would release the key, and with it, silence. Such a show deserves an audience. He built the illusion of a woman who died to the music she loved. And the feather is his signature, red with the craftsman's varnish, white with the river's claim. He leaves it as a fool leaves poetry. He moved to the private stair. The brass key let us in again, and we went down into that narrow throat of the house where the river's breath was close to the stone. Holmes kneeled on the last step, and with his blade he lifted a tiny bit of grit. "Iron dust," he said, "the mark of a wheel. Our man worked here with his hands while London slept. We went out by the gate." The river bank, seen from the doorway of a home, looked like a great animal at rest, its sides rising and falling with the patient movement of the tide and boats. On the underside of the gate, by the hinge, a smear of varnish had dried to a clear tear. Holmes touched it with his forefinger and held it to the light. It caught the light and flashed like a tiny insect's wing. "Grossman again," he mumbled. "He is either our murderer or the most noble helper alive." We were not upstairs for long before. The bell announced Mr. Swan. He entered, with the broken dignity of a man who has kept all his outward habits against a storm that has broken him inside. He was tall, serious, with a banker's short way of speaking and an artist's confusion in his eyes. Holmes's questions were the tool that tuned him, gentle and exact by turns, and from the sadness came these notes. Eleanor had indeed been a customer of Miss Partridge. Eliza had recently been fascinated with a group that spoke of saving the city's songs from being forgotten. And in the past week, a gentleman with pale eyes and careful hands had visited the house to discuss getting work for a concert to help river widows. "His name?" Holmes asked. He said, "Grossman." Mr. Swan's hand trembled. "He promised to make Eleanor's piano sing like a bell. We thought it was kindness." He stumbled on his words. "You will find my child?" Holmes bowed his head as if to a king whose crown is sadness. "I shall find where the truth is hidden. Sir, if Eliza is alive, I will bring her to air. If she has gone where her mother waits, I will bring you knowledge. There is nothing else that does not rot the heart." The afternoon turned into a damp evening with little ceremony, as if London could not be bothered with changes. Holmes sent a message to Lestrade. 2 men at Hungerford Steps, one on the opposite shore. Eyes open for lanterns, and ears open for 5 notes. He ate nothing at our quit tea, and spoke less, moving about the room in that slow way of his, which means that his mind is racing while his body walks. At 1:15 midnight, we stood on the lower stones near the bridge. The river lay like black slate beneath us. The lamps above were smears of yellow cut by iron. Fog had gathered again, but not in the solid way of the previous night. This was a living thing with channels and gaps, so that the water would show in sudden cracks and then be hidden again. An officer's cough sounded once far off. Lestrade's shape was a darker piece of dark near the pier. His patience was wrapped around his suspicion like a rope. Holmes lifted a hand, and it seemed to me that even the water paid attention. Then, clear as a thought spoken aloud, came the first note. It hung without shaking, neither loud nor soft, the exact sound of a call that wants to be answered. The second followed after 2 breaths. The third rose a tone, and the fourth fell, simple as taking a step. The fog took them and did not dull them. Instead, it multiplied them, so the sound seemed to come from all the arches at once. We listened hard for the 5th, And in that listening, every sense found small things: the slide of oars against a boat, the whisper of rope on wet wood, a lantern shaped cleverly, like a swan's neck and head gliding in a clear patch of air. A person stood in the small boat, small and upright, a cloak around the shoulders, hair hidden under a knitted cap. The lantern made a pale island on the water, and in it the face was a white oval, too far to be sure, but near enough for hope to rise like a fever. Holmes's hand gripped my sleeve once, hard, and then fell, because the fifth note did not come. Instead, there was a harsh scraping sound, like a wire snapping under tension, and the Swan lantern jerked sideways, dipping to the river's surface as if an invisible hand had grabbed it. The small boat turned in the current. The person inside threw one arm out to keep balance, and from upstream in the fog, a second light flared and vanished like a wink. Holmes was already moving silently, a gray shadow becoming part of the other shadows. "Downriver," he said, though to whom I cannot say, because his voice was barely speech, just purpose given breath. "They have changed the stage." And the river, woken up by the break in its music, seemed to take in a long, cold breath. The river, once woken up, does not quickly go back to sleep. In that moment, when the Swan lantern was knocked sideways and the fifth note failed, the Thames seemed to pull tight like a rope. There was the scrape of wood against stone, the clatter of a boat hook hitting iron, and then the cry of a boatman who had seen nothing and therefore imagined everything. Lestrade's whistle cut the fog with two blasts and was answered from somewhere under the bridge, where an officer's lantern swung into sight and out again like a moth at a window. Holmes had already reached the lower steps. I felt his sleeve slip from my fingers and went after him, my boots skidding on slimy stone, the smell of tar and old water thick in my lungs. We were in time to see the small boat right itself. The person inside, small, still stubbornly upright, had grabbed the Swan lantern before it sank, and now held it to their chest like one cradles a frightened bird. The current turned the boat's nose toward the shore, but from upstream a second boat appeared, low and swift, its oars quiet, and its front fitted with a covered light that only showed a thin sliver on the water. 2 men sat in it. The one in the back lifted his hand and made a small motion that might have been a greeting or a threat. The person in the small boat answered not with words, but with those same 4 notes we had heard before, soft, firm, somehow personal, and the second boat turned as if the water itself had changed beneath it. "Hold there!" Lestrade shouted, his voice echoing against the arch. "In the Queen's name." The man in the back lifted something that caught the lantern's glimmer. A coil of rope, perhaps, or wire, and the front man dug his oars in hard. The little boat slicing into the dark mist like a knife cuts through cheesecloth. Holmes did not waste breath chasing them by water. He ran instead along the riverbank, keeping the other boat in hearing distance more than in sight, reading the river by sound as well as any pilot. I followed, my lungs burning, the stone wall on my right a cold ribbon under my palm. Lestrade, to his credit, moved as quickly as any of us, efficient even in a hurry. A whistle was answered from the next landing. Shapes separated from the fog and became men with boots and a duty. The river muttered beneath us, annoyed by the disturbance. Near the shadow of the railway bridge, Holmes stopped so suddenly that I almost ran into him. He crouched, fingers on the stone edge, and a moment later had reached down and brought up a loop of fine wire that had been hooked on an iron ring set into the stone. The loop vibrated faintly, as if remembering a song. "So," he said, almost to himself, "they have wired the bank as they wired the room, a stage with many traplines." Lestrade was at his shoulder. "What devil's game is this?" "The oldest," Holmes replied, "the one in which those who understand the rules of the show seem to perform magic." He let the loop fall and straightened up. Your men will not catch them on the water tonight. They have prepared their exits as carefully as their entrances, and the fog is their cloak. We must turn to land, where showing off outruns being careful. Which is to say? Lestrade demanded. Which is to say, the Strand, Holmes answered briskly. Terence Pike prints not only programs, but invitations. If there is to be a sad song, he will have left some trace of his audience. We found a taxi at last, the driver blinking like an owl at being dragged into work after midnight. Holmes slipped into the seat as if into an unfinished thought. Lestrade and I crowded in opposite him, the swaying lamp above making islands of our faces as the taxi rattled over the stones. The city at that hour speaks in whispers. Beds creak, shutters breathe, a cat's cry sounds like a moral lesson. Holmes's long hands lay still on his knees, but his fingers moved slightly, as if counting. 4 notes, he mumbled once. 4, the 5th held back, and the lantern jerked sideways by an unseen line. They plan interruptions, not songs. They mean to point attention where they are not. In plain English, Lestrade grumbled, they mean to make fools of us. Not of us, Inspector, said Holmes, not unkindly. Of London. Pike's shop looked innocent. Shutters were latched, the glass dark. Holmes worked at the door with 2 thin tools that would not look out of place in a surgeon's case. The lock gave way with the humble obedience of a lock that has not yet learned about crime. We entered to the thick smell of ink and metal. Holmes's lamp made low star patterns in the brass parts of the presses. He moved without hurry and without wasted motion, going first to the waste bin by the typesetter's frame, and then to the shelf underneath, where proofs are left to dry. It was Lestrade who found the first direct proof of wrongdoing. "What's this?" he said, pinching up a narrow strip of paper. It was a ticket printed on cheap card. The letters were arranged with the tidy, self-righteous style of Pike. The Swan Benefit respectfully announces a private performance this night by water. Requiem for the forgotten. Those who would give to charity are invited to give in silence. Holmes took it, sniffed it, turned it to the light. Wet ink, he observed, printed no more than a few hours ago. Pike may be timid, but he is hard-working. He drew open a drawer with his thin fingers and found there the rest of the tickets, maybe 2 dozen, tied with string. Each had in the lower corner a tiny red speck, a swan stamp made so small it was just a blush. Lestrade's jaw pushed forward. He is caught by his own hard work. Holmes's attention had shifted to the typesetter's tray, where letters lay in neat iron lines. He leaned in and smiled, the thin smile that means a small certainty has appeared. Note the spacing between words, Watson. See how the spacer sits a little high. That is an amateur's worry for neatness. But here, he moved his finger to the line that named the hour. The hand has changed. The spacing becomes easy. Someone else has set this, not Pike. A man used to type in surfaces to the tiny measurements of alignment. Our instrument maker, he has been at this bench. Lestrade's satisfaction cooled a little. Grossman, then. We will have him if we must drag the river for his shop. Holmes's finger continued down the tray. And below, a name that is not quite a name, Mrs. Adela Shaw, announced with no last name, as if she were both married and not. The same for Miss E. We are asked to see both the living singer and the dead one. The program is a call to spirits. Blasphemous foolishness, said Lestrade, though he looked less certain than he sounded. A faint sound scraped above us, like a chair leg on an upstairs floor. Lestrade instinctively reached for his club. Holmes lifted a hand for silence. We listened. The scrape came again, then the soft sound of a window being pushed open, and a breath of colder air coming down the stairs. Holmes's lamp was out before I had thought to warn him. He moved toward the steps, like a cat. From the darkness at the top of the stairs, a voice dropped down, tired and frightened, and dry as paper. "Is that you, Mr. Pike?" Holmes did not answer, and after a moment a figure crept down 2 more steps. A woman in a plain coat, hatless, a coil of hair pinned low on her neck, the paleness of long hours in an ink-room on her face. When she saw Lestrade's badge, she stopped as if she had hit a wall. "Mrs. Adela," Holmes said gently. She flinched at her name, and for a moment I thought she would run back up the stairs. But the habit of police authority pulled her down, and she sank onto the step. Her hands clasped so tight I could hear the glove stitches creak. "He said he would get me when the tide turned," she whispered. "He said the river forgives by night, Grossman?" Lestrade asked sharply. She shook her head. "He does not forgive, that one. He uses. He told us the song would make sadness useful. But sadness is not a tool, sir. It is a room one learns to walk in. I left the society a week ago. I could not bear the sound any more." Holmes took out no notebook, but his attention made a page out of the air. "Yet you came tonight to Pike's to warn him?" "He printed at first, because we said it was for charity, then because he was afraid. He received an envelope for every batch. No note inside, only a red stain like a petal. He thought it a sign they were watching." Her eyes lifted to Holmes for the first time, urgent and real. "There is more than music, sir. There is machinery. They have built something under the arch, a cage of wires and wheels, and they lay the lanterns along the lines like beads. When the 5th note sounds, the lines move. Doors open, lights drop, a boat is pulled as a child's toy is pulled along a string. It looks like magic, too. Those who do not see the iron." Holmes's face in that dimness had the focused and awful concentration of a man before a chessboard whose pattern has suddenly shown him both a trap and a way out. "Who keeps the key to the cage?" "Grossman," she whispered. "And Mr. Pike has the map for when it must be moved. But there is another who walks among them and opens wallets. He speaks softly and is dressed like a gentleman. They call him the benefactor." Lestrade shot a glance at me that said as clearly as words that he smelled at last the police's favorite target: money. "His name?" "I do not know it," she said, "only that he wears a ring with a swan cut in opal, and he never touches the water. He waits on the bridge and looks down as if counting the city." She twisted her hands once more. "I saw Miss Eliza there. She is quick, brave, and foolish. She believes the music tells the truth. But tonight, sir, they meant to grab her back. When the 5th note failed, it was the sign for the lines to close." Holmes was already moving toward the door, the decision made in him before the police had reached for a warrant. "Lestrade, your men on the river hold their positions. Double those upon the arches. Place one at each stair, and one at the wall where the watchman stands. No man with a swan on his hand passes without answering for his sins." Lestrade bristled. "Mr. Holmes, if you imagine I will command the police to your whistle ... Holmes turned on him with that special authority that even the most stubborn officials learned at last not to challenge. "Inspector, if we do not close the arch tonight, we will not close it at all. Your orders will get the machinery. Mine will get the motive. Together, we may yet prevent a second tragedy. Apart, we will be reading names in the Strand as gossip writes them." He softened a little. "I do not want your interference. I require your interference, but let it be the kind that puts pressure where it is most felt." Lestrade stared at him for a moment. Then the professional in him took over the man. "Very well," he snapped. "But if I find you have used me as bait, Mr. Holmes, I will carry you to Bow Street on my own back." "You may," said Holmes, and for once a hint of humor warmed his voice. "But you will find I wiggle. We came out to a city just before dawn. That hour when London looks like the backstage of its own play, lamps flickering out. Stray dogs sniffing yesterday's show posters, the air tasting of cinders and milk. Holmes hailed a taxi and gave an address that surprised me. Not the bridge, not the Swan house, but a street off Pall Mall, where clubs sleep heavy and servants rise early. He sat forward as we rolled, his eyes not on us, but on some inner map whose lines only he could see. "Watson," he said at last, "notice how pride tied those tickets. String, not ribbon. Cash on delivery. A gentleman benefactor who never touches water and wears an opal swan. A banker who keeps a private stair to the river and locks away letters he does not read. A governess who speaks like a woman who has dealt with both music and men. There are 2 theaters in this city, one above the river, one above criticism. I go now to see which curtain hides our missing girl." The taxi turned into a narrow lane. Holmes told the driver to wait and went up the steps to a door whose brass was bright enough to show any man his face. He placed his finger on the bell and then, with great politeness, did not ring. He bent instead and studied the keyhole, then the plate of the knocker, asterisk. Then the faint half-circle of scratches on the paint underneath. When he straightened up, there was a serious light in his eyes. "Lestrade will have his machinery," he said quietly, "and I shall have a name." A faint breeze came, carrying the far, thin echo of a river note. No more than a memory, perhaps, but enough to raise the hair on your neck. Holmes looked toward that unseen water for the briefest moment, like a hunter salutes the area he plans to hunt. Then he turned back to the door and lifted his hand, and in the quiet before the first knock fell, it seemed to me I could hear the entire city take a breath. The door on which Holmes was about to knock belonged to a house whose brass had the moral brightness of well-kept money. Pall Mall lay in those minutes before the city was fully awake, when only servants and milkmen moved, and even the taxis looked sleepy. Holmes did not knock at once. He leaned his head, looking at the plate of the knocker, like a scientist might study a rare beetle. Then, with the care of a surgeon making the first cut, he tapped twice. It is a strange thing how the servant of a rich person knows who is outside by the very way they knock. The door opened no more than an inch, a slice of darkness showing an eye and a triangle of starched shirt. "Closed," said a voice that had learned to be respectful without ever being friendly. "Then you will not mind if we come in for a moment," Holmes answered, and put his card through the space with such gentle firmness that the door had no choice but to open wider to take it. A butler of middle age, precise in every way, looked at the name on the card with the slight narrowing of his eyes that shows recognition in men, who are paid never to be surprised. "If Mr. Ellis is at home," Holmes said lightly, "tell him that a small matter about a ring has suddenly become very important." "I am not allowed," the butler began. But Holmes had already let his eyes look past the man into the cool inside, to a table where a tray for visiting cards lay, and on a green cloth the faintest half-circle of dry dirt, the kind the street leaves on leather shoes. His voice changed by a tiny bit, losing the light, polite sound and taking on the lower, steadier tone with which he speaks to men whose duty and fear run side by side. "We will not trouble your master," he said, "for I see he is not here. The club has called him earlier than usual. Please tell his lordship instead that the gentleman wearing an opal swan on his finger is being watched, that the police now have men under Hungerford Bridge, and that a woman's death has stopped being a matter for music." The butler's color changed as much as a trained face will allow. He pulled the door back another inch, either to let us in or to get some air. Holmes neither entered nor pulled back. He let the silence gather like dust. And then he added with a politeness that cuts, "Also tell him that shellac is a brave stain for a feather, but a poor varnish for a conscience." The door closed softly like a promise, and the lock's tongue slid home with the sound of a decision being changed. Holmes turned at once, the street taking him back like a river takes back a boat. "He is early to his club," he said, "which means he is early to read the morning's lies." "The Strand?" I asked, catching up to him. "You think the newspapers will have it already?" "My dear friend, rumors wake up before the milkman." He stepped into the first taxi we found and gave the Strand as our destination. "There is a time and a case," he went on, "when the city chooses its story. If we want to prevent a panic, we must catch the story by the tail and teach it better manners. The Strand at that hour had all the busy quiet of a theater before a show. Printers' boys darted with bundles under their arms. A man with advertising boards yawned into his sign like a sleepy turtle. A street fiddler tried to play a song to a crowd too hurried to pay for sadness. The smell of hot metal hung in doorways. The sidewalks were damp with last night's fog, which had turned into a layer of dew. Holmes moved with quiet speed, parting the crowd as a man parts a thought. We reached a newsstand, and he tossed a coin with a flick that caught the seller's loyalty faster than any argument. The headline stood out as if pleased to be noticed: "Midnight Swan, River Ghost, or London Murder?" Underneath it was the kind of writing that pretends to just ask questions while eagerly giving answers. I read enough to feel the old irritation that doctors feel when the newspapers give medical advice. The writer spoke of strange cries, of a line of widows on the water, of a gentleman supporter whose generosity hides a darker group. There was even a paragraph in which my friend was praised as that master of strange logic, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who is known to untangle the very threads of fate. Holmes's mouth twitched without amusement. "We will give them a thread they can hold," he said, and without any more fuss, we entered the offices of that weekly paper, where I have from time to time been guilty of adding more romance than is good for any science. The editor, a man of wit and ink, who kept both in neat bottles, looked up with that quick welcome that comes with a name that sells papers. "You are early by an hour, Mr. Holmes, but not unwelcome. London had a swan for breakfast and wants a ghost for lunch." Holmes smiled like a swordsman smiles at a skilled opponent. "Let us feed them a villain instead," he replied. "Ghosts are bad for digestion. Villains bring out the best in an Englishman." He did not sit. He dictated a note, unsigned and careful, setting out the most basic useful truth: that a mechanical device had been discovered under the bridge, that the police had placed men to seize it, that supporters sometimes choose the shadows so that their names may shine brighter later, and that any person invited to a riverside concert by unknown people should prefer charity by day to kindness in the fog. He left out names. He left in a warning. The editor, who had long practiced walking the narrow line between sensation and lawsuits, nodded, fixed 2 commas, and showed us out as if we had brought him both danger and grace. On the sidewalk, Holmes's attention turned to a jeweler's whose window was only a hand's width of gold thread on the street. "Opal," he said, half to himself, and with that special efficiency that wastes no time explaining to someone who has walked long beside him. He went in. The shop had that gentle quiet you find in rooms where expensive things feel safest. A man with a nose like a falcon's beak looked up from a book, with the mild surprise of people used to visitors who only arrive by appointment. Holmes greeted him as one craftsman to another. "A strange order, sir. A ring in the shape of a swan, cut into an opal, ordered within the past month by a rich gentleman who prefers not to touch the river." The man's eyes did a thing that would have been a blink in anyone else. He set down his pen, put his fingertips together, and thought about whether to tell the truth. "We are private," he said finally. "So am I," Holmes answered. "We share an enemy, bad taste. Opal does not take a carving well. It clouds if breathed on too warmly, and it looks bad in a London fog. You tried to talk your client out of it and failed. A fleeting professional shame softened the jeweler's manner. "You speak my language, sir." The ring was a foolish idea, but money has its ways of persuading. The gentleman wanted a bird in flight, neck arched, wings tucked. The work was done with a diamond point. A thin gold setting kept the stone from too much stress. "I remember the hand that signed it was a banker's," Holmes prompted. "They're supporters," the man corrected mildly. "In London, they are often the same. He signed a private name whose accounts are held under a public one. If you press, I must stop." Holmes's smile was not kindness. It was appreciation. "I press only with a finger," he said, and laid on the counter not a warrant, but a tiny sample of scratches he had lifted on a strip of wax from the Pall Mall knocker. "Please be so good as to tell me whether this scrape matches the gold of your opal setting." The jeweler examined the wax with a magnifying glass, humming, and then looked up with the quiet honesty of a man who will not lie. "Even for gold." "It does." "Then I thank you," Holmes said, and left him with his privacy safe, which is a gift some men value more than money. On the sidewalk once more, I could not keep from him the question that had worn through my patience. "Holmes, do you plan to catch the benefactor where he sits, or to shame him into backing down?" "Shame is a tool like any other," he said. "But we will save it. The police are better at catching than at shaming. We will give to Lestrade what belongs to Lestrade, and keep for ourselves only what will not be understood until it is over." We had not gone 10 steps before a boy in a messenger's cap bumped into Holmes as if the city itself had thrown him at us. "Telegram for Mr. Sherlock Holmes." He squeaked, and when Holmes broke the seal, I saw his eye take in the lines with that hungry speed which is the only hunger I have ever seen him fail to control. Wheels and wires seized. Grossman fled. One man taken. Pike found with map and small press with crimson seal. 5th note was lined to close cage. "Urgent you come?" Hungerford, Lestrade. Holmes's nostril took the faintest breath of victory and annoyance mixed together. "So our printer finds ink on his hands after all," he mumbled, "and our stringed instrument maker proves as slippery as his varnish." He hailed the nearest taxi, like a man calls a thought already formed. "To the bridge," he told the driver. And to me, in a lower voice, "We will let the press whisper, as it pleases, Watson." Our work returns to the river. Hungerford had gathered a small asterisk. Uneasy crowd, rivermen with faces like old rope, 2 clerks who should have been at their desks, a flower girl who was only slightly more afraid of the police than the cold. Lestrade stood by the wall with that lean, bristling pride which is the police's true uniform on a morning when the handcuffs have at last found wrists. At his feet lay a device of wheels and pulleys so delicate that it looked like a spider's idea of a loom. Fine wires trailed from it into the arch, where officers were untangling a net of lines cleverly fastened to iron rings. A smaller box, no larger than a case, contained a battery and a set of reeds, the kind you see in small organs. "Electric," Lestrade said, almost with enjoyment, as if the modernness of the evil increased the goodness of the arrest. A current to start the machine, a reed to give the Swan its voice, and these, he tapped a row of metal tongues, to strike the notes. When the 5th goes, the wires pull tight, and whatever is on them comes or goes as ordered. "The river as a theater," Holmes said, and put a single finger to one shining wheel as if in both blessing and disgust. "Where is Pike?" "In the arch office," Lestrade answered, white as wet paper and babbling that he only set type. "He'll be setting bars now if I have my way." He glanced at Holmes with the old mix of rivalry and reluctant respect. "Your warning in the Strand will have villagers with sticks beating the riverbank by noon. The commissioner will call it panic if he reads it before lunch and public service if after." Holmes did not smile. He had gone still with that inward stillness that tells me he hears through other men's noise. He raised his head. "Hush," he said, though no man had spoken. From the river's shadow, thin and faint as breath on glass, came 4 notes. They were not struck by a reed or a tongue. They were sung, a girl's voice, tired, firm, the very sound I had heard in Eliza's scribbled line of music. The crowd stopped as if a hand had gripped them. The officer in the arch froze with a wire in his palm. Lestrade's eyes searched the water like a terrier searching for a rat. It smells but cannot see. "The 5th, I whispered. "Will not come," Holmes said, and his voice, low as it was louder than the river. "Because she has learned. She holds it back." A shadow moved under the bridge, no more than the difference between water and water, but I saw it as clearly as if it had been painted. A narrow small boat was tucked into the shelter of a pier, its lantern dark, its line cut from the main trap. A figure kneeled inside it, hands to her mouth to project the sound, and on the stones above, in the very crack where the arch met the riverbank, a smudge of fresh varnish told where some last link had been broken. Holmes's hand closed on my arm so sharply that the pain steadied me. "She is alive," he said, "and she knows more than our enemies wanted her to know." Lestrade was already shouting orders, but Holmes's voice wove through them, cool and absolute. "No whistles, no rush. If you scare the arch, you drive her into the current. Send a man to the next stair, and another to the upstream pier. We will take the shore as music takes a phrase, quietly from underneath." He stepped down into the dampness, and we followed, and London, which had been content to gossip, drew closer to listen. The Strand would name it what it could. The river would name it what it must. Between them, in that narrow crack where wire had met stone and had been cut, a girl had stolen back for herself the power of the 5th note, and with it, perhaps, the ending of the song. Getting a living person from the very edge of London stone is a delicate operation, and it is made no easier when the city watches with the mean curiosity of a crowd. Holmes's command for quiet was obeyed, because the sound of his voice is the kind that persuades even the fog to lie closer. Lestrade signaled with his fingers instead of his whistle. 2 officers moved upstream like shadows. Another crouched at the next stair, where slime made every step a trap. Holmes went first, not on the steps, but along the lowest row of the riverbank stones, his hand on the top, his boots getting wet from the river, as if he were crossing a constantly weeping doorway. I followed and felt, as one always does at the water's edge, that old feeling of being close to some patience older than men. She waited under the arch. The small boat pulled into a fold of darkness, where the tide stroked the wood with small, secret sounds. When Holmes reached the last step down, he did not call her by name. He held his lamp at his waist, covered the light with his palm, and lifted it once, twice, like a private signal remembered from better days. There was the faintest scrape of wood against stone, and then the boat came out of the pocket, like a whisper entering a room. The Swan lantern lay dark in the boat. The girl's face, when the dim light reached it, had the hollowed beauty of someone who has stayed awake for a long time. Her eyes too bright, her cheekbones too sharp, her youth worn at the edges by the river's rough hours. She seemed younger than 17, and older than I have any right to say of any living person. Holmes crouched on the lowest step, close enough that she could touch him if she wanted to, far enough that the water could still take her if she trusted no one. He spoke with that tone that confuses his enemies and wins over his lost children, not soft, but cleanly made of truth. "Miss Eliza Swan," he said, as if giving a diagnosis that heals rather than condemns. "You have cut the 5th note. You have therefore cut the trap. That is good work." Her breath shook. Then she let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been made in a place where laughter goes thin. "It was only wire," she whispered. They made such poetry of it, and it was only wire. Most poetry is made from such accidents, Holmes answered. Will you come up? There is a policeman who will lend a hand without being bossy, and a doctor who will say little and look less if you ask it. She lifted her chin, defiant, tired, and then with a move that confesses what pride refuses to say, she put her hand in Holmes's. Between them, they made that ridiculously difficult journey by which a human being leaves water for stone. When she stood on the stair, I saw that her cloak had been cut at the bottom where the varnish had touched it. The cap on her head was damp and streaked with dirt. She glanced once toward the arch, as a hunted animal glances back to be sure the bushes do not move. And then she became steady. It is not over, she said. They will come for the manuscript. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Then it is held somewhere they do not control. She nodded, a small, fierce motion. They think Grossman keeps it in his shop. He keeps a fake one there. The real book is with me. Lestrade, who had come down 2 steps and held his men back with a look that would have steadied horse soldiers, spoke in a voice that remembered mothers. Miss Swan, he said, you're safe. Mr. Holmes is with you. If there's something at the bottom of this that can be brought to court, we'll do it. Eliza's eyes touched him like a candle dipped at a parade and moved on. It returned to Holmes. If I give it to you, she said, will you promise not to let them turn it into a show? They kept telling us it was for charity. They made death look like a parade. My mother hated parades. Holmes did not make promises he could not keep. He bowed his head, as serious as an oath. I will promise you this. We will use only the part of the show which frightens the guilty and frees the living. It was enough for her. She reached under her cloak, and from the lining brought out a package wrapped in waterproof cloth, no larger than a gentleman's diary. Her fingers trembled, not for show, but from the cold and the river and the fact that she was very young and had been very brave. Holmes tucked the package into the inner pocket of his coat, where I have seen him carry weapons and evidence, and once for a full day a kitten rescued from a chimney. Then he stood up. Inspector, he said, take Miss Swan to Baker Street by the most private road you have. Place a plain-clothed man at our door and another at the stair. Send Pike to the police station and keep him from the newspapers. As for Grossman, he will run to water or to his rich supporter. I will meet him at both. Eliza's mouth opened as if to protest being separated, then closed. She looked up at the bridge. I could not tell if she was listening for the 5th note or for the sound of those steps that move across. London, when rich men take their evil deeds out for a morning walk. Mr. Holmes, she said very low. They said the manuscript was older than the song. They said it was a map. So it is, he replied. But each reader chooses whether a map shows a way out or a way in. Baker Street had that strange peacefulness that Mrs. Hudson keeps, even when we bring her chaos. She took the girl in with a quick tenderness that asks no questions and makes good tea. While Lestrade put his men in place, Holmes drew the curtains and set the waterproof package on our table. He did not cut the wrapping like a boy tears at a package on Christmas morning. He unbuttoned it like a surgeon uncovers a wound. Inside was a bundle of pages tied with a narrow cord. The paper was old and thick, and had absorbed the smell of every room it had been in. On it were music lines and notes in different handwritings, black, brown, rust-colored with age, some neat, some rushed, all very focused on the same simple tune. 5 notes stepping and falling, changed in speed and key over the years, with notes written in the margins in English, in German, and once, to my surprise, in a boatman's rough, spelled-out slang. Holmes's fingers touched the margins with the respectful closeness he saves for things made by minds. As hungry as his own. You see, Watson, he said, and in his voice was that mix of pity and admiration that a scientist feels for a mistake made with genius. It is indeed a map, but the mapmakers got their country wrong. They believed they were charting the river's soul. They were only tracing the city's sounds. He began to order the pages by eye, and soon a structure appeared, the kind of skeleton that tells a doctor whether life was once in the thing. The oldest pages, 200 years old, if the paper was to be believed, recorded a call used by boatmen in fog, a practical way for one boat to ask another to show itself. Later hands had made it romantic, writing it for violin, for a trumpet, for a choir of singers to sing from the bridge to the water. There were notes in the margins describing how sound behaved under certain arches, how a lantern placed at a certain angle would seem to float against the current, how a line thrown from a ring here would pull a small boat there like a magician's scarf. Near the end, in Grossman's thin, elegant handwriting, was the idea that had turned a craft into a danger. If the fifth note is delayed, the listening ear becomes helpless. At its release, all attention jumps. The line must close in that pause. Eliza had sat quietly by the fireplace, her hands cupped around Mrs. Hudson's blue china, watching Holmes read as if he were untying a knot that had been in her hair for weeks. "I thought it was true," she said at last, without feeling sorry for herself. "I wanted it to be. London is so full of noises that one wishes for a beautiful one to mean something." "It does mean something," Holmes replied, still turning pages. "Beauty means that a man can be persuaded to open his wallet or his heart. Those who understand that are saints or villains, depending on whether they feed the hungry or themselves." Lestrade stood with his arms folded, doing the difficult task of not interrupting the one man in England whose sidetracks save time. "And our benefactor?" Holmes's mouth tightened. He slid from the manuscript a smaller sheet tucked among the older pages as if hiding in their skirts. On it were not music, but numbers, columns of donations, each entry marked with a code instead of a name, the amounts round and confident. At the bottom, in a different ink, was a flourish. The flourish was not a signature, but a private show-off of one who has admired his own initials for too long. Holmes looked not at the ink, but at the paper's edge, where a mark had pressed through from another sheet. He sprinkled ash on it, breathed, and blew. The ash stuck where the indentation was. The Swan, no bigger than a thumbnail, arched its neck in opal mockery. "You will have your banker, Inspector," he said. "He is having breakfast at his club, reading a version of events he paid to have written, and before lunch he will send a man to get what he believes is his account book. He does not know that his account book sings." Eliza set down her cup. "Grossman said the river punishes those who break the harmony." "Grossman is mistaken about who does the punishing," Holmes answered. "It is not the river that punishes, it is consequences. But he is correct that a note once played must be resolved. He will come to you because he cannot stand an unresolved note." He turned to Lestrade. "Place plain-clothed men at the club door. 2 more in the alley. If our gentleman leaves by the front, bow and let him pass. If by the side, step on his foot and call it an accident." Lestrade grimaced. "And Grossman?" "He goes where all ghosts go when they are named. Back to reality. He will look for his instrument. He will look for his notes. He will look for his choir. He will think he can trade truth for pages. I will meet him where men trade on water." Holmes closed the manuscript and retied the cord with the same exactness with which he had undone it. He placed it in the drawer where I have seen tobacco, pistols, and the strangest treasures of the strangest city. He locked the drawer and placed the key in his pocket, which is not the same as safety, but is the beginning of it. Then he turned to the girl. "You must sleep for an hour," he said, "and eat more than you want to. When you wake, you will tell me how the society chose its places, and who stood nearest the benefactor when he pretended to count lanterns. You will tell me whether Mrs. Shaw sang because she wanted to, or because she had no other song. And you will tell me who taught you to cut wire with a boat knife without cutting yourself." She looked at him as if he had spoken not to her fear, but to her dignity. "Miss Vale," she said simply. She said, "There are two kinds of obedience in the world, and only one is worth a girl's hands." Holmes's eyes, for the briefest moment, softened. "Then we shall give Miss Vale work that will please her." He glanced at the clock. "Watson, your revolver. Inspector, your patience. The tide will turn at noon, and men who think they are above it will discover their mistake." It was near that hour when the knock came, which I have learned to tell apart from all others. Not a client's knock, nor the shy tap of curiosity, but the polite, practiced knock of one who does not ask to enter, but announces that they are. Holmes did not move to the door. He placed a finger on his lips for Eliza, gave a small nod to Lestrade, and gave me a look by which he has more than once placed me, as if I were a chess piece. Then he took the manuscript from its drawer and laid it, wrapped once more, on the table where any man who thought himself bold might grab it. "Enter," he called. The butler from Pall Mall, maybe with a new job or a relative of that group, stepped inside as if the room were a drawing room, and we were his social duties. Behind him, steady and slick, and smelling faintly of Florentine iris, came the gentleman with the opal swan on his hand. He was exactly the sort of man to whom London lays out its carpets, tall but not too tall, lean but not hungry, a face put together by a painter who understood the value of holding back. He bowed to me as if I were someone he knew, to Lestrade as if he were furniture, and to Holmes with a politeness that could have been either admiration or a warning. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "you have something of mine." Holmes looked at the ring and then at the man, and then, very deliberately, at Eliza. "On the contrary," he replied, and his voice was very gentle, "I have in my keeping a city's conscience." The gentleman smiled. "A phrase," he said, turning the ring so that the stone caught the firelight and made its little shiver of color. "But I have always enjoyed a phrase." Holmes did not look at the ring again. "You shall enjoy a confession," he said. And in that instant, as if the city had decided to put a period on the sentence, the distant sound of a river horn sounded, low, patient, unavoidable, announcing the tide's turn. He stood in our doorway as if polite society had just missed him, and we were a pleasant replacement. His gloved hand rested lightly on the head of his cane, the opal in its gold sitting breathing a faint, watery fire. Lestrade's presence did not seem to bother him. Eliza's did. His eyes touched her, dropped to the wrapped manuscript on the table, and returned to Holmes with that calm curiosity I've seen in men who have long mistaken their desires for principles. "You have something of mine," he repeated, the even rhythm of his voice, a lesson in the gentle handling of servants and listeners. Holmes bowed his head as one acknowledges a line well spoken in a play. "I have an accounting," he said. "Whether it belongs to you will be proved by numbers you would rather not see put before the public." "A threat," the gentleman observed pleasantly. "A description," Holmes answered, just as pleasantly. "You have led a society whose stated goal is charity. In the course of raising money for river widows, you have discovered that sadness is a fine instrument when well tuned. You hired Mr. Grossman to create a setup by which notes sung at midnight could move wire as well as pity, and a certain printer to hand out invitations to a show that demanded silence from others and secrecy from you. You wear on your finger a fancy idea cut in an unsuitable stone. You do not touch water." The opal flashed once, as if some color within it had been caught by a phrase. "These are harsh conclusions," he said, "especially without proof." Holmes's gaze went without hurry to Eliza Swan. "There is proof," he said quietly. "It breathes and it sings." The gentleman's eyes narrowed a fraction, and then went back to being calm. "Miss Swan," he said with a bow that would have been fine in a ballroom, I am sorry for your trouble." Eliza's hands, which had been steady on the rim of Mrs. Hudson's teacup, tightened. "You made our sadness into a program," she said. "You told us the river had a voice, and you asked us to drown in it a little for the sake of the city." "Passion gives to charity what simple duty cannot," he answered. "I supplied the money and the order. Others supplied the sound. We are all, in our own way, benefactors. Benefactors do not buy feathers for coffins they plan to watch," Holmes said, and his tone lost the silk that had hidden the steel. Inspector Lestrade stepped forward with the official patience he saves for men whose expense accounts frighten clerks. "Your name will do for now," he said. The gentleman's glance, which had moved so lightly over all of us, came to rest on Holmes again. "You plan to arrest me in my friend's drawing-room?" "I plan," Holmes replied, "to invite you to take a drive with us to the river. We're a boatwoman with a steady eye and an inconvenient memory wants to confess the exact way in which Mrs. Eleanor Swan was carried. Not from water to piano, but from one kind of stage to another. If you are, as you say, a supporter of order, you will welcome the chance to hear a truth that has gone too long unsung." A flicker, and no more than the blink of a shutter, passed through the man's calmness. He looked very briefly toward the manuscript. "You would bring that into the mud?" Holmes's mouth lifted by a tiny bit. "The mud has already read it." He gestured to me. I placed the waterproof package inside my medical bag and buckled it. Eliza stood up. Lestrade's men, posted as quietly as furniture, moved into those corners of the room from which movement becomes planned. Our visitor hesitated long enough to figure out his chances, short enough to keep the appearance of control, then swept his hat under his arm and smiled. "I hate a scene," he said. "You have my company." The day had a lean look, as if London had been made from pewter. We passed through streets that seemed to have been rubbed with ash. The very puddles were tired. At the river, the tide was low and sulking, the banks showing their dark insides of weeds, rungs, and slime. Under the shadow of the bridge, where Lestrade's men had taken apart the clever cage, an old barge sat tilted. Her deck was a patchwork of tar and mended sail. Her owner was a woman whose back had learned the language of ropes and barrels. She had the sort of face that tells the truth, because it is too much work to lie and haul things both. "Mrs. Brant," Lestrade said, with that rough politeness he offers the brave poor. "These are the gentlemen." Her eyes, gray as ivory carvings, took us in, sized up Eliza, and settled on the opal ring with a spark that was not admiration. "I carry barrels," she said. "I do not carry sins. I told your man I was done with it." "You are paid," the gentleman with the opal observed, the first gentle sharpness in his tone. She spat neatly over the side. "Paid to keep my eyes on the river, but I'm not blind." Holmes lifted her hand. The old woman's anger, finding a better target, turned toward it. "3 nights ago," she said, "a small boat ran alongside where no honest boat runs. The tide was wrong. The wind was wrong. The hour was wrong. The lamplight was covered so as to be a glow and not a beam. They had a bundle, and it was not heavy, or 2 men would not have lifted it as they did. They put it down like a toy on your wire, and when the 5th note went, the wire pulled it as a man reels in a line. The bundle went up where the window was open. The key sang once like a mosquito's fiddle, and then was quiet. There was a feather on the water. I have carried saints' bones in my time, and crates of French brandy. I know the difference in weight and in fear. She was dead before the river saw her." Eliza made a small sound, a breath breaking on a rock. Holmes did not touch her. He rarely interferes, but he positioned himself so that the river, not the memory, would be in front of her eyes. "You have seen the man who signaled?" he asked. "Yes," she said, with the comfortable disrespect of the very poor for the very rich. He does not touch water. The gentleman's cane clicked once on the plank. I am no boatman, he said, nor am I a murderer. Tragedy follows the river as flies follow butchers. My goal was kindness, twisted by a mechanic's pride and a girl's romantic foolishness. Grossman's name darkened the arch as if the very syllables had stained the air. The stringed instrument maker himself did not appear, but his work was everywhere. The scuffed place on the stone where a pulley had dug in. A wire whose varnish still shone like dried tears. The faint, wicked hum that a loosened wire made when the wind touched it. Holmes's eyes took these in as a plant expert catalogues a poisonous garden. You have chosen your confession, he said to our visitor, but you have mistaken the priest. The city will hear you without forgiveness. He turned to Lestrade. You have the printed tickets, the machinery, the map, the printing press, marked by another hand. You have a witness who saw the body staged, and can swear that the window played its part by wire and not by magic. You have a gentleman whose ring matches gold shaved on his door knocker the night he fled early to his club. You have a girl who cut the fifth note and lived. Lestrade's lean face wore the expression I have learned to love in him. That bleak satisfaction of the professional when the facts have fallen in a row and the duty is a straight line. He stepped to our guest with a respectful seriousness that makes English law as unavoidable as gravity itself. I'm afraid you must come with me, sir. The gentleman looked not at Lestrade, but at the river, as though the water might be persuaded to change its mind. For a charitable donation, he asked lightly. For conspiracy to obstruct justice, to use a death for financial gain, and for whatever charges Mr. Grossman's eventual confession will add, Lestrade answered. And if the coroner finds what I expect under the skin of that feather stain, he nodded toward the quill Holmes had saved. You may have varnished more than a feather. The opal made a last pale fire. He bowed his head as much to fate as to the inspector, and offered his wrists with that ease which tells you a man's life has made him used to being dressed by others. The snap of the handcuff on bone sounded shockingly loud against the low talk of the tide. 2 officers led him to the waiting taxi. Eliza waited until the wheels had grown small, and then turned to Holmes with an urgency that made her appear both younger and infinitely older. Grossman will come, she said. He cannot bear to have the song end without him. He will come, Holmes agreed. He will come to the only stage he trusts. His glance shifted to Mrs. Brant. You will be paid, madame, to do what you have done best, to keep your eyes on the water and tell the truth when the time comes. She sniffed, pleased to have a command rather than pity. I will do as I was always going to do. We returned for a short hour to Baker Street, not to rest, because Holmes's kind of work is a fever which only sleeps when the person does not, but to look at the manuscript once more. He spread a map of the Thames on the table like a surgeon laying out a body, and placed beside it the oldest page, the boatman's call. They believed, he said, that sound wakes what sleeps. It does, but what sleeps under London is not spirit. It is habit. A tune one has heard too often will pull a foot as surely as a rope will pull a boat. Our enemies counted on that habit. Miss Swan broke it. Eliza stood by the fire, the steam from her tea like a ghost lifting out of her. And my mother? Holmes's answer, when it came, was the one I had dreaded and hoped for in equal measure. Dreaded for the pain in it, hoped for the strength. Your mother died in the room she loved, he said seriously. The river was made to be her messenger after she was gone. There was no drowning, no struggle with water. She was carried by hands too practiced to leave mistakes behind. He paused. I will have the coroner, who is a good man, look again at the chemicals in her house. The show of a single note often hides a simpler poison. She bowed her head. Then the river is innocent. The river, Holmes said, is not capable of being innocent. It is only itself. Men put their wants on it and call the answer fate. Toward evening, a note arrived. No stamp, no envelope, only a scrap of paper folded on itself and smelling faintly of varnish. If the benefactor falls, the audience demands a final act. Midnight under the arch. Bring the book or hear the fifth. No signature, no need for one. Grossman's hand was in the curve of the threat, that thin, elegant disregard for results that do not include applause. Holmes read, folded, and placed the scrap beside the old boatman's call. He wants to direct the final scene, he said. We will let him, but the play will end as written by the part he cannot control. And what part is that? I asked. The part where the city stops listening to lies, he replied. Inspector, your men will be under the arch and on the wall as before, but they will not move until the fifth note threatens. Miss Vale must stand with Eliza at the upstream stair. There are things women see on the edges of a crowd that a policeman never does. Mr. Swan will be brought, not for show, but for identification. And Mrs. Brant, he smiled a little, will keep her barge where a man may make a fool of himself trying to escape. Night fell with ceremony. As if London had remembered, it was a city and dressed for the occasion. Lamps took their places. Fog drew its curtains, and the Thames became once more a black isle under a roof of iron. We were early at the arch, which is to say we were almost too late, because the river keeps different hours from those on land. The dismantled wires lay in coils. The fancy spider loom had been removed to the police station. Only the rings remained, silent as old piercings in a healed ear. Lestrade placed his men like a chess player places knights, set to leap but forbidden to run. Mrs. Brant's barge dozed downstream, her lantern's cover a thin blush. Miss Vale, calm as a prayer, stood with Eliza in the edge of shadow where the stair loses its last step to the water. At the stroke of 11, a violin sounded. Not the machine's reed, not the river's echo, but a human hand on a human instrument. The tune rose, simple and unstoppable, the old five-note call corrected by art into temptation. It came from the center pier. A figure waited there, tall, his hair blown pale in the draught under the bridge, the outline of a case at his feet. He played without hurry and without hope, which is to say, with that special pride that belongs to men who have made a god of their skill. Grossman, Eliza whispered, and made a small move forward that Miss Vale stopped with a hand. He will see me. He must, Holmes murmured from the darkness near the arch. He cannot help but see those who listen. The first four notes fell into the water like beads. The crowd, small, easily influenced, created by rumor in the hour between supper and sleep, leaned toward the sound. Somewhere a man laughed, and was silent as if ashamed before a church. Lestrade's hand rose, and the police became a series of held breaths. The fifth note did not come. Grossman stopped. The bow hovered for a moment in the thin air, and then dropped to his side. He looked not at the arch where the law waited, nor at the steps where youth held itself back, but up toward the bridge's wall, where gentlemen sometimes watch things with kind supervision. The spot where the benefactor had stood to count his city was empty, and the emptiness insulted him. He raised his head and laughed softly, a sound that carried like a knife point. "You have broken the harmony," he called. His accent made the words click like cold metal. "So let the river write the last line." He slung the violin over his shoulder, placed two fingers to his lips, and gave a whistle that was not music. It was answered once, faintly, from the upstream darkness. A small boat detached itself and slid toward him, dark on dark. "Now, Inspector," Holmes said, and the quiet broke. Officers rose from the stone as if the riverbank had given birth to them. Mrs. Brant's barge pulled from her sleep with a grunt and a shove. The small boat, seeing its escape route barred, turned dangerously. its oarsmen cursing in a language not fit for publication. Grossman, with the perfect practicality of men who love their instruments more than their lives, pushed the violin case into a corner of the pier and swung down to the lowest rung. "Hold!" Lestrade cried. Grossman looked back once. "You cannot arrest sounds," he said, and slipped like a fish into the Thames. For an instant all was chaos. A splash, a lantern thrown, a rope cast with excitement and aim equally poor. Then a shape rose beside the pier, hands finding iron with the certainty of long practice. He would have reached the rung if a smaller hand had not closed on his wrist from the stair's shadow. Miss Vale held him, not strong enough to pull him free, but strong enough to keep him from climbing. Eliza seized the other hand. Together they made their courage into a weight, and for the first time I heard Grossman make a sound that was not planned, something like surprise and anger tangled together. He struck at the girls, not like a gentleman, but from drowning panic. That movement cost him. Mrs. Brant's line found his shoulder. Lestrade's men found his arms. Holmes, who had moved with the efficient speed that saves energy until it is needed, had him by the collar with that firm, steady strength I've seen him use when a life depended on it. They laid him on the stones, pale, gasping, his pale eyes furious and afraid. Holmes bent over him, not victorious, only finished. "The city has heard your confession," he said. "It was not in notes." Grossman shivered once. "The river is older than you," he whispered. "And consequences are older than both," Holmes answered. He straightened up, water running from his sleeve. The crowd loosened into talk and footsteps. Rumor, sheeted of a show, settled for details. Lestrade barked his orders with the crackle of a fire, finally under control. The small boat's oarsman found himself, handcuffed to a ring and making strange promises to the iron. Eliza leaned her forehead for a single moment against Miss Vale's shoulder, and then looked up with dry eyes at the arch where her mother's last show had been made. In the pocket of the bridge's shadow there was only stone and water, and the last dull glow of an opal flame disappearing around a distant corner in a taxi bound for the police station. Holmes touched my sleeve. "We have taken the power out of their fifth," he said. "Let us see if we can take the profit from their first." "What first?" I asked, chilled to the bone and tired in every nerve. "The first lie," he said. "Tomorrow the city will wake to its papers. Let us make sure that when it does, it reads an ending that will keep it from going to the river for a show again." He looked not at the water, but at Eliza. "And then," he added, very low, "we shall carry a feather where it belongs." The fog had thinned, but London had not grown cleaner. Its light was only paler, like guilt rinsed but not forgiven. The night on the river had left a bruise on the city's silence, and though the dawn came in its proper order, there was something strained in its color, a gray too bright to be natural. Holmes had not slept. He rarely did when a case, like a flame, had found its last blue edge before going out. He stood by the window, the thin white of the morning running across his face, and in his hand was that feather again, no longer a symbol of horror, but of conclusion. "Watson," he said without turning, "do you remember what I told you of art? That it begins where lying ends." I stirred from the armchair, where I had been pretending to sleep, more from sympathy than tiredness. "I do, and I begin to think that the opposite is also true." He smiled slightly. "Yes, Grossman mistook art for a trick. He imagined that if he could make men believe the river sang, he could make himself believe he was its priest, not its helper. But no man baptizes sign in varnish, Watson. It sticks too fast." On the table lay the manuscript, its cord now cut, the pages spread like the wings of something that would never fly again. Eliza's small hand rested on the margin. She had refused rest, despite Mrs. Hudson's firmest advice, and now sat near Holmes like a student, who will not leave until the lesson is finished. Miss Vale had gone with Lestrade to make statements. The police station was a nest of confession, denial, and paperwork, which is how empires clean up their crimes. The city had begun to mutter again outside. Cartwheels, hooves, the calls of sellers, and from the Strand, the distant rattle of printing presses, turning truth into news. Holmes lit a cigarette, his manner strangely calm. "They will ask for a show," he said almost lazily. "Lestrade will give them law, and we must give them meaning." He moved to the table and picked up one of the pages, the one where Grossman's hand had written in its clear, European precision. "If the fifth note is delayed, the expectant ear grows helpless." Holmes read it once, then tore it cleanly in half. "I've always disliked bad comparisons," he said. A knock came at the door, firm, official, and completely awake. Lestrade entered, his coat damp from the morning, and his expression a mix of tiredness and victory. "We've got the whole group, Mr. Holmes. Grossman sings more than his own notes when pushed. The benefactor won't talk yet, but his books do. I'll bet your instincts against any jury in London." Holmes bowed his head. "That is satisfying, Inspector. The world will sleep better when men realize charity and theater are not the same business." Lestrade sat down heavily, the kind of tiredness that belongs to those who have at last placed the final brick in a long wall. "Funny thing," he said after a pause. "The men who came to those river concerts weren't villains at all. There were clerks, shopkeepers, even an alderman's wife or two. They thought it was art. They thought it was London's conscience-given music." "People will believe any melody," Holmes said, "if it flatters them into thinking they have a soul." Eliza looked up. "And yet music isn't evil, Mr. Holmes. My mother believed beauty could heal." Holmes's expression softened for a moment, like the light on water. "Your mother was correct. But beauty requires truth, as a mirror requires light. When men use one to hide the other, they create something monstrous, a reflection that moves, but without life." Lestrade stood up. "The police will see to the rest. I'll have men take the machinery to Scotland Yard's vault, and I'll see to it that the press gets your version of the story, or at least enough of it that they don't invent worse. As for Grossman, he's quiet. The river nearly swallowed him last night, but the cell will keep him until the law has its say." "And the benefactor?" "I asked." Lestrade's mouth twisted. "He sits behind iron and fancy chairs, muttering about art and redemption. I've heard worse sermons in my time." When he had gone, Holmes crossed to the window again. The morning had brightened, but the fog clung low on the river, that faithful helper to mystery. Eliza watched him with that focus the young have when they sense the end of something huge, but cannot yet name it. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "what will happen to them?" "Grossman will find the river colder than he imagined, though the walls of Newgate Prison are dry," Holmes said. "Your benefactor will buy sympathy until his money or his friends are spent. The printer will disappear into some smaller business where type does not spell ruin." "And London?" "London will forget, as it always does, by remembering wrongly." "That seems unfair," she murmured. "It is the nature of justice to be incomplete," he replied. "If it were otherwise, no man would dare to live in a city." She hesitated. "And my mother?" Holmes turned to her then, his eyes steady, but not cruel. "Your mother is beyond all questions now, but her name will not be printed among the ugly details. You have my word." He reached for his violin, which had lain untouched on the mantel since the night the cry first crossed the Thames. He drew the bow gently, coaxing from it the faintest echo of that five-note tune, but changed, softer, rising instead of falling, ending on a note that was not resolved but peaceful. "The difference between a sad song for the dead and a lullaby," he said, setting the instrument down, "is only intention." One mourns what has ended. The other mourns what must begin. Mrs. Hudson entered with the morning paper folded under her arm like a piece of laundry. "You'll want to see this, Mr. Holmes," she said, and left with a shake of her head. The headline sprawled like an accusation. "The Midnight Swan. Horror and Heroism on the Thames." The article underneath had the rhythm of Lestrade's dictated words, but the polish of a journalist who had added feeling to fact. It spoke of the courage of Miss Eliza Swan, of a gentleman supporter unmasked, of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, whose swift thinking prevented more disaster on the river. Holmes's lips twitched once. "They will print it beside advertisements for fake hair restorers," he said. "Fame, my dear Watson, is a gas that expands to fill the least deserving space available." He passed the paper to Eliza, who read it without tears. "It makes her sound like a story," she said. "All lives do," Holmes replied. "The difference is in who writes the last line." The day went on, quiet and strangely slow. The river fog lifted at last, and the sun turned the water to dull silver. Miss Vale returned to take Eliza under her protection. The girl, having thanked Holmes with a dignity beyond her years, left us with a feather held in her hand. When the door closed behind them, Baker Street felt emptier, as if an echo had left. Holmes stood for a long while before the empty fireplace. Then he turned to me with that dry half-smile which usually comes before the remark that ends a case. "You see, Watson," he said, "the Swan was never from midnight at all. It was only a reflection, white on black water. Men heard what they wished to hear." He gestured to the manuscript, now folded again. "The police will seal that, but it will not burn it. One day some serious history lover will rediscover it and write a paper proving that London once had a call to the river. That is as it should be. Every city needs its ghosts. And what of ours?" I asked. "Mine are restless only between cases," he said. "Yours, my dear friend, can be cured by exercise and brandy." He crossed to the window one final time. The Thames moved slowly in the distance, carrying the pale pieces of mist like torn paper. Somewhere a boatwoman sang, a rough, wordless tune that might once have been beautiful. Holmes listened until the sound faded. "Do you know, Watson," he said at last, "I begin to believe the river truly does have a voice. But it speaks only when men stop talking long enough to hear it." He turned back to the room, his profile carved in the thin afternoon light. "The tragedy of the Midnight Swan is over," he said, "but the melody will remain." He took up the violin again, drew the bow once more, and the note that followed seemed to hang in the air longer than the sound itself. Not sadness now, but release, the quiet exhale of a mystery finally allowed to sleep. Outside, the river answered with its patient murmur, and London, unsorry and eternal, went on breathing. The final days of the case passed not in victory, but in that strange quiet that follows any win over darkness in London. The city has a way of swallowing such things, as if its stones were made to digest scandal until only a legend is left. By the time the Sunday papers had finished their hunger for mystery and moved on to the week's political troubles, the tragedy of the Midnight Swan was already being sung in pubs as a warning song. Some swore they had seen the girl at the bridge, in a white robe and unharmed. Others that her spirit floated on the tide, singing the river to sleep. But for those of us who had looked directly into the eyes of the case, no superstition could make it less human. It was on the fourth morning after Grossman's arrest that I found Holmes once again at the window. His lean figure wrapped in his old robe, the smoke of his cigarette rising in pale spirals like ghostly musical notes. He had been writing most of the night, as the mess on the table showed, a half-finished paper on sound-based tricks in cities. He never called his cases by their romantic titles, but I knew that somewhere between the lines of that dry paper lay the last echo of the Midnight Swan. Without turning, he said, "There is a strange pattern in human regret, Watson. When a man does something awful in the name of beauty, he feels neither guilt nor pride, only confusion. He cannot tell the moral from the beautiful. That is the true result of art separated from conscience. I answered softly, "You are talking about Grossman, among others." He flicked ash from the cigarette. A man believed he was serving some higher harmony. It is the same false idea that inspires conquerors, prophets, and critics. He has been charged, quite rightly, with conspiracy and manslaughter. But his crime, really, was one of understanding. He understood the world as a piece of music meant to be played for his own amusement. He turned then, his eyes bright with that special fire that being tired often gives him. "Do you realize, my dear Watson, that London itself is a symphony? Each street its own instrument, each man his note. The marvel is that the whole messy sound results in anything like order. The river? Ah, the river is its bass line. Constant, unchanging, ancient. When men try to conduct it, they only drown." Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson entered with the mail, a small stack of envelopes on her tray. One had the official seal of Scotland Yard. Another was sealed with black wax, and had no address, except for Holmes's name, written in a firm feminine hand. He reached for the second one first. It was from Eliza Swan. The handwriting trembled only slightly, but the grace of her mother's teaching was in every curve. "Mr. Holmes, I have gone to live with Miss Vale in Surrey. The house stands on a hill where one can see the river's glimmer, but not hear its song. I think that will be best. They tell me the benefactor has confessed to all that can be proved and to much that cannot, as men of his kind often do when they find the world is no longer their audience. I wish no revenge, only quiet. My mother's name will rest where it belongs, and I will keep the last feather she wore. If you ever walk by the riverbank and hear a tune that seems familiar, do not be alarmed. It is only memory returning to its own water. Miss Vale says there is kindness even in forgetting. I hope she's right. With thankfulness, Eliza Swan." Holmes folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the drawer with the manuscript, now tied again in plain string. "She has enough courage to make peace with memory," he murmured. "It is a rarer gift than figuring things out." The letter from Lestrade was shorter and written in the quick, clipped tone of a man who has already told the story too many times. Grossman to stand trial. The benefactor's accounts seized. Pike let go and likely to leave the city. Machinery examined by experts from the university. Nothing supernatural, though it nearly fooled them. The police credit your help for preventing a public panic. Scotland Yard sends thanks. Holmes smiled faintly. An institution thanking me, Watson. That may be the surest sign that I have made a mistake somewhere. We had breakfast late, as was his habit after a case. The fog outside had thinned to an honest mist through which the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral looked like a faded coin. Holmes pushed away his plate untouched and leaned back in his chair, the cigarette again between his fingers. "It is finished," he said, though his tone suggested it was not. "Yet there is something left over, a question that refuses to go away." "What question?" "The fifth note," he replied, not in the mechanical way that we have understood, but in the spiritual way. "Why 5? Why not 4 or 6? Grossman claimed it represented completion, the solving of a problem. But there is another possibility, that the missing fifth, held back and then released, is like conscience itself, the delay between temptation and realization." He stood up and crossed to his violin. I knew that posed too well to interrupt. He lifted the instrument, set it under his chin, and began to play the Swan's melody, changed, altered, purified. Where Grossman's had been a temptation, Holmes's was a question. The notes filled the room with that strange, smart beauty that seems to make sound itself think. When he reached the fourth note, he paused, his bow held ready. And the fifth? I prompted softly. He smiled. A fifth must remain unwritten. He drew the bow away, and the silence that followed was deeper than any note. Around midday, another visitor came, an unexpected one. The card had the name Mrs. Attalus Shaw. Holmes raised his eyebrows. Coming back to life seems to be contagious. She entered with the air of a woman, long used to secrecy, and now freed from it. The color had returned to her cheeks. She was simply dressed and calm. "I only wished to thank you," she said, "and to give you something that was left at my rooms. It may be of use, or at least of curiosity." She placed on the table a small, tarnished tuning fork, its handle engraved with the same swan symbol we had seen on the ring. "He used it," she said. "He said the river would answer if one struck it on stone. I tried it once after they were gone. The river did not answer, but I thought you might like to see the thing that fooled so many clever men." Holmes turned it over in his hand. "The echo of a false idea," he murmured. "Thank you, Mrs. Shaw. Keep yourself to daylight from now on. The city is safest when we accept that it does not listen." After she had gone, we sat in silence. The fork gleamed faintly in the lamplight, humming the ghost of a tone we could not hear. At last, Holmes stood up and carried it to the fire. "There," he said, casting it into the flame. "Let the river keep its mysteries. We are guardians of reason, not collectors of ghosts." That evening, he asked me to go for a walk with him. We went down toward the riverbank, where the lamps burned steady in the clean air. The water slid by, moody but obedient, no longer singing. The bridge above us looked huge and silent, its arches black with memory. Holmes leaned on the wall, his face half in shadow, and looked down where the tide ran thick and slow. "Do you remember, Watson," he said, "when we first stood here? I thought the cry across the river was a thing from another world, but it was only London calling to itself. Then you believe the matter is closed?" "As far as the law is concerned, yes. As for the truth, it is never closed, only quieted." He pulled his coat closer. "There will be other swans, Watson. Not of music, perhaps, but of politics or faith or progress. Each will promise beauty. Each will demand silence. Our job remains the same, to cut the wire before the fifth note sounds." We walked on. The street lamps wavered in the mist, each one a halo without a saint. In the distance, a church bell rang 6, its sound falling across the water like slow rain. Holmes stopped listening, and I saw again that special light in his eyes, the reflection of a mind meeting a mystery and not looking down on it. "It is an old city," he said at last. "It learns slowly, but it does learn. There will come a day when beauty is not feared and reason not hated. Until then, there is work to be done." He turned from the river, and together we went up toward the glow of Baker Street. Behind us, the Thames kept its silence, vast, patient, not curious. But I imagined, as the fog closed once more on its surface, that I heard from far away a single soft note rising, not of warning this time, but of release. And perhaps it was only the wind under the arches, or the last piece of Holmes's violin staying in my memory. But I like to believe it was the river's own confession, murmured into the dark, that it too had been fooled, and was glad to rest. Thus ended the case of the tragedy of the Midnight Swan, not with applause or scandal, but with the quiet sound of London breathing again, as though the great machine of the city had finally let out a breath, cleaned of a poison it never knew it had swallowed. And when I turned to look once more at my friend, he was already walking ahead, his tall figure half lost in the mist, as if he too were a part of the city's music. And the next case, somewhere in that endless fog, was already calling his name. The end.